Well, my name is Nick Spencer, and I'm Senior Fellow at the Christian think tank Theos. And it's a real pleasure for me to be hosting this lunchtime seminar. Theos, for those of you who don't know us, is a Christian think tank. We've been going for 20 or so years now, and our objective is to tell a better story about Christianity in contemporary public life. Better in two senses of the word. Firstly, more accurate. There's a lot of mis and disinformation about Christianity, about faith floating about. And so research is at the core of what we do. We want to tell a better story, as in a more truthful story. But also we want to tell a better story as a more cogent, a more persuasive, a more winsome story. Theos is a Christian think tank, and we're unapologetically so. We believe that faith is a positive in public life, and we want to make the case for that. We want to make an honest case for it. And so making a cogent and coherent case is part of making a better case for Christianity specifically, and faith more generally in public life. Like I mentioned, we were started in about 2006, which by some quirk of divine humour was a month or so before the God Delusion was published. And so for the first 5 years or so of our existence, the waters in which we swam were full of sharks saying things against religion, against Christianity, very pro-secular, very pro-rationalist. To make a case for Christianity in public life back then felt vaguely risky. But things are changing. In fact, there's a perception that things are changing quite a lot, and have done over the last 5 years or so. There is, in fact, quite a lot of Christian rhetoric around today, and it comes in some very different forms. In America and in Europe, far-right extremism has gained ground over recent years, and sometimes it has done so by using Christian language, Christian symbols, rhetoric, imagery. For some, Christianity and the language of the Christian civilization or the Christian nation has been weaponized as a way of, quote unquote, defending ourselves against them, whether they are Muslims or migrants or people in favor of multiculturalism. How prevalent is this, and how concerning is it? What does it say about the role of faith in public life? How have the churches responded? What, in any case, is the far right, and how, for example, does it differ from the hard right? Is all talk of Christian civilization or Christian nation completely beyond the pale? And is there a distinctive and constructive Christian response to all this that doesn't simply see the churches aping secular liberal platitudes? To discuss this, I'm joined by two speakers who really know whereof they speak. Reverend Dr. Helen Paynter is founding director of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence, and the director of Theological Education at Bristol Baptist College. Dr. Maria Power is a senior research fellow in human dignity at the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford. And between them, they recently edited the book, The Church, the Far Right and the Claim to Christianity, which looks at this issue and which, for full disclosure, I contribute the chapter to. Our plan for the next hour or so is as follows. I'm going to hand over to Helen and Maria shortly, and they're going to talk to us for about 20 minutes or so with slides. And then for about 10 minutes, I'm going to interrogate them and ask them to clarify what they're saying and maybe to push back slightly. Then I will introduce and hand over to three eminent respondents that we have, Robert Beckford, Anne Richards and Nick Lowles, whom I will introduce in due course. We have given them a very tough task of responding to what they've heard in 3 to 4 minutes or so. All the way through, we'd like to hear from you, and there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Because there are so many of us, what we have done, or so many of you who are watching, what we've done is arranged for you to ask your questions through the Q&A box, and I and other members of the Theos team will be checking it as we go through the event. And I will hopefully, in the last 10, 15 minutes or so we have, take some of the questions you have asked and put them to Helen or Maria or the three respondents. Can I make a plea that if you want to ask a question, you make it succinct and specific. I know there is a real temptation in these things to put hundreds of words into a chat box at the bottom because you're passionate about it, but unfortunately we rarely have the time to read and put hundreds of words to our speakers. So we really want to be able to ask them your questions, but could you please make them specific? Theoretically, the seminar ends at 1:30. I'm not going to give us a hard stop at that time. If we've still got questions coming, I'm happy to go to 20 to 2 or whenever suits, but obviously people leave when they feel they must. I think that's all in terms of housekeeping. I'm now going to hand over to Helen and Maria to talk us through their presentation.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you so much to Theos for being willing to host this webinar. We're delighted to be doing this in partnership with you. Let me just share my screen a second. Is that looking good? Great, thank you. Rise up, O Lord, and may thy enemies be dispersed, and those who hate thee be driven from thy face. These words from Psalm 67 were placed at the top of a chapter in the 1500-page manifesto of Anders Breivik. Breivik, as many will remember, went on to murder 77 people, mainly teenagers, in Oslo and Utøya Island in 2011. His manifesto also stated this: you can either choose to learn how to rise up in the power of your Lord and Saviour and learn how to become a true warrior in the Lord, or you can continue to keep your head in the sand and oppressor after oppressor will keep beating you down. Tragically, this is not the only example we could provide of the misuse of scripture or Christian ideas in such ways.
In Hungary, Viktor Orban has positioned himself as the defender of Christianity against a dangerous influx of Islam, which is arriving with refugees from the Middle East. He says, the masses arriving from other civilizations endanger our way of life, our culture, our customs, and our Christian traditions. As the influence of this Christian nationalism has grown across Europe, the Christian faith has been used as an excuse for resisting migrancy, sometimes violently. This is a screen grab from a few years ago, where the inhabitants of the Greek island of Lesbos, which admittedly has been hugely and disproportionately affected by the migrant crisis, were seen pushing a boat of refugees back out to sea with the cry, "We're Christians, but we should also look to the West." In the United States, we have seen an extraordinary commingling of religious idolatry and political language, sometimes amounting to near idolatry. During the 2020 presidential campaign, Vice President Mike Pence intentionally misquoted the book of Hebrews. Let us run the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Old Glory and all she represents. Let's fix our eyes on this land of heroes and let their courage inspire. Let's fix our eyes on the author and the perfecter of our faith and freedom. And never forget that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Here are some more recent screen grabs from social media, selected to show the tight association in many American minds between patriotism and God.
Well, let's turn to the UK. In the lead up to the 2015 general election, the United Kingdom Independence Party published what they called a Christian manifesto, headed with the title Valuing Our Christian Heritage. In its foreword, the party's then leader Nigel Farage wrote, "Britain needs a much more muscular defence of our Christian heritage and our Christian constitution." In parts of the British Church, a much more muscular defence of reputative Christian heritage is exactly what we seem to be getting. On 5th of April last year, which was during Ramadan, Bristol Cathedral hosted a grand iftar, inviting any citizen who wanted to join with local Muslims as they broke their fast after sunset. Large crowds gathered on College Green just outside the cathedral, and also when it began raining, they were invited into the cathedral itself. Now, I've seen no suggestion, and I've looked quite carefully, that any act of worship was conducted within the cathedral on that occasion. Video footage from the event simply shows people, many but not all, in traditional Muslim dress, enjoying food together with children playing alongside their families. Commentators immediately took to their microphones and keyboards to denounce this. One of them is an ordained priest who is a prominent influencer with around 1/3 followers on Twitter. He took it as a sign that we are living in the Islamic Caliphate of Great Britain. And that particular Twitter thread attracted over 6,000 readers in the immediate days afterwards, with many people chipping in to call for defence of our land, exorcism of the cathedral, and most disturbingly, for crusade. And this sort of thing isn't confined to political posturing or ranting on social media. In 2014, members of the political organisation Britain First invaded mosques across the UK with army-issued Bibles, and they called it a Christian crusade. In the following 2 years, Britain First members made a habit of parading through Muslim-majority areas of several British cities, aggressively flourishing large crosses.
Now, the terminology we're using is actually quite tricky. One of the leading specialists on far-right movements, Cass Muda, defines the far right as those on the right who are anti-system, which he defines as being hostile to liberal democracy. He then divides that into 2 subgroups: the extreme right, which rejects the essence of democracy, that is popular sovereignty and majority rule. And classic examples of this are Hitler and Mussolini. By contrast, the radical right accepts the essence of democracy, but opposes fundamental elements of liberal democracy, such as minority rights, the rule of law, and separation of powers. Because this terminology is so slippery, we prefer to speak of right-wing extremism. Happily, the most extreme and violent manifestations of this ideology are struggling to gain purchase in the UK at present, but we should not be complacent. As we have seen, many countries in the rest of Europe and beyond have not proved so immune. But within the UK, mainstream forms of the far-right movement are growing in influence and plausibility. The 2024 report by Hope Not Hate plots a significant advance even in the past year, both within fringe political movements and within the Conservative Party itself, as well as in popular news outlets such as GB News. The mainstreaming of far-right discourse makes it more acceptable, more electable, and, as we shall see shortly, more plausible to the Church.
We will now list in a moment, the key ideological features which mark these movements, but I want us to note a few things before I do. First, I want to state clearly that I believe this list is in direct continuity, at least in some of its points, with entirely legitimate and unreasonable political and theological positions. And we are not seeking to vilify anyone who wants tighter controls on migration, for example, or who takes a conservative perspective on issues such as human sexuality. We are interested in the extreme versions of these ideologies and when they are being used to promote violence. The second thing to say is that this is not a tidy, self-contained catalogue. Different groups will emphasise different things, and some right-wing extremist groups hold diametrically opposed views on certain issues. So, an indicative list of ideologies will generally include a cluster of some or all of the following: a nationalistic urge tending towards ethnic or Christian nationalism or even white supremacy, which may be expressed as racist abuse or violence. Related to this, there is often a strong anti-migrant invective, often employed in dog whistle racism. We don't want to dilute the Christian values of our nation with Muslim immigrants may actually code for we don't want any more brown-skinned people in our streets.
Next, we have traditional ethics around human sexuality and gender, which in the hands of far-right groups can manifest itself as homophobic or transphobic violence, or the intimidation of staff and patients at abortion clinics. Fourth is anti-Semitism. This is a variable element, especially since the 7th of October attacks. Some right-wing extremist groups, though, are aggressively Zionist. Fifth, Islamophobia. In its various forms, this is a relatively uniform element of far-right political expressions in this country. And finally, there is conspiracism around a variety of issues, such as those listed on the slide.
Now, viewers have probably spotted that some of these themes will be appealing to Christians, and in fact, they may intersect with what we might consider perfectly legitimate theological concerns. The idea of cleaning up the morality of society is appealing to many who mourn the national decline in ethical standards. The far right's restoration of family values has links with authentic biblical themes of fidelity and covenant love. The recovery of a Christian past in the face of a threat posed by Muslim immigrants appeals to a fear of persecution, which is perfectly legitimate in some overseas contexts, and the faithful desire to see the one true God worshipped. For these reasons, some of these views are not niche within the Church. A study conducted by the Pew Research Centre in 2018, which clearly needs to be repeated now, surveyed attitudes of Christians in 15 Western countries, including the UK. Looking at the UK data, in response to the statement that it is very or somewhat important to have a British English family background to be truly British or English, this generated a 72% agreement from church-attending Christians, compared with 53% in the overall population. So these may all feel like worthwhile aims to many Christians when they hear such policies or rhetorics being offered. But what they may fail to appreciate is that the motifs are sometimes being cynically employed for a darker purpose by those whose allegiance and values are quite contrary to Christian ones.
In 2020, Hannah Stroman and Ulrich Schmeidel published a book called The Claim to Christianity. In the book, they examine the theological claims made by 4 different far-right groups in Europe. And they say this: trained theologians might not like these political readings of the Bible. Biblical scholars might say they are historically implausible, that they are hermeneutically incorrect, or that they are willfully wrong. But these readings are still there. The theologies that run through the far right didn't appear out of nowhere. Now, this is a challenging suggestion. Stroman and Schmeidel are challenging the Church to stop disowning the issue as someone else's problem, and to face up to the uncomfortable fact that it is Christian-adjacent theology that lies behind some of these movements. So what can we do about it? In May of 2023, funded by the British Academy, we gathered a group of 14 invited participants for a 24-hour consultation, which we conducted at Bristol Baptist College, as you can see from the photo. They represented an international, ecumenical, and interfaith, as well as interdisciplinary group, with academic experts in a variety of fields, alongside those with on-the-ground experience of helping the Church respond to the democratic threat posed by extremist groups. We were moderately racially diverse, but regret that due to circumstances beyond our control, our Black contributor was unable to participate at the last minute. Our task was to consider how the UK Church should respond to the rise of the radical right, and our discussions are represented in the Church, the far right, and the claim to Christianity.
At the end of the book is my own concluding chapter, where I reflect on the conversations that we had and try to draw together some common themes and strands. Out of our discussions, I've distilled 10 concrete recommendations for the British Church. They're not the only things that could be said, but they're 10 things that I felt were important to say. And we're going to go through them now. So first of all, the Church must own up to, rather than attempt to conceal, our own historic and indeed our contemporary complicity with racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. We need to be honest about the times we've got it badly wrong, whether that was done through a theology we would completely disown, or whether the rhetoric lies uncomfortably close to our own theological position. And we need to notice the ways that our scripture can seem to promote such ideologies when incautiously or cynically interpreted. And we must therefore take care in the pulpit, for example, that we don't unwittingly collude with these ideas. Second, we need to speak publicly to disavow any violence done in the name of Christ, particularly at senior denominational level.
Third, the Church should be very wary of enforcing far-right liberal stereotypes of Muslim illiberality, which it may unwittingly do by positioning itself as the primary upholder of democratic dialogue. Sometimes the urge to stand in neutrality, to hold open spaces where all people of good will can meet to dialogue, implicitly positions the Church as the prime upholder of democratic values, and positions others, such as Muslims, as beneficiaries of that at best, or at worst, as threats. Fourth, many of us will have the commendable instinct to dialogue with those on the far right, to try to persuade them to more moderate ways of thinking. When convening dialogues, we need to be sure to agree rules of engagement in advance and then enforce them. And we need to model the virtue of healthy disagreement and to train our congregations in these virtues. It helps nobody if we become like those we oppose, mirroring their violent rhetoric with our own.
Fifth, we need to seek and propagate rich and nuanced understandings of the causes of far-right movements and avoid demonising certain demographic groups as pervasively racist. For example, it's increasingly clear that many of the people engaged in extreme right-wing movements at the moment are wealthy. There's plenty of dark money funding these movements, and it's not coming from the council estates. At the same time, we need to be more attentive to the factors which can drive far-right ideology among deprived groups and view that problem as an issue of structural injustice rather than of sinful bigotry. We also need to avoid reinforcing the divisions between natives and immigrants, here the scare quotes there, by casting hardship relief as a zero-sum gain. Our challenge is to find ways of ministering to the hardships of all simultaneously. No one, I think, can fairly accuse the British Church of being indifferent on matters of food poverty, fuel poverty, human trafficking, refugees, and so on. But projects working primarily for the relief of what we might call traditional communities, and those working for the benefit of asylum seekers, for example, have tended to be managed by separate interest groups within the Church. Interest groups which can therefore tend to pit their priorities in opposition to one another in the pursuit of funding and support. We need to find ways of joining up these equally valid concerns so that they are not in competition with one another. Seventh, we should attend to the rising problem of youth radicalisation by investing in youth work and youth programmes, especially those which enhance dialogue across religious and cultural boundaries. We should train our young people in critical thinking and model these virtues in public and private conversation. As I was starting to acquaint myself with the issues in this broad area, I attended a conference where I heard testimony from two formers. This is people who had formerly been radical and violent. The striking thing was that both of the men interviewed had been radicalised in their teens, and neither of them had had deep right-wing convictions in the first instance. They were drawn into these movements because they encountered a group who showed them respect, affection, and community. And I was left wondering what might have happened if they had found a thriving church youth group instead.
Eighth, theological education matters. If we are tempted to water down the theological and biblical training of ministers and priests, we do so at great risk. This is one of the challenges that most, if not all, theological colleges are facing in the current UK climate, where previous funding models are falling out of favour, and the much quoted line, "We've had enough of experts," is finding approval in parts of the church. There is clear evidence that those in our congregations who are regularly exposed to faithful, well-developed biblical teaching are less likely to show signs of radicalisation and violence. And as we have already discussed, the true and good biblical themes, which can be misapplied or misunderstood to great harm, require wise and responsible handling by people who have deep roots in the scriptural and theological traditions of our faith. Ninth, we should be faithful to the calling of the church, learning to express radical love and welcome, and conversely to stand against hatred and divisiveness in creative, non-violent ways. Ultimately, this is not a problem that can be solved with a set of practical suggestions. It is a spiritual problem which can only be addressed by spiritual means. The church has a prophetic calling. It is called to bear witness to the teachings of Jesus Christ by word and by deed. We are to witness in speech and action to the peaceful, just, and holy world that God is inaugurating. And finally, we need to notice the particular gifts which the various ecclesiastical traditions can bring to the struggle. As a Baptist and a Roman Catholic, we feel that our own traditions both have particular things to offer, and perhaps we might pick up on this in the questions later.
In conclusion, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. This speaks of patience and smallness. And that fundamental truth is often overlooked by those who seek to employ power for their own theological agendas. That applies both to those who are promoting the ideologies of the far right and to many who seek to counter them. It is not by force or coercion that the kingdom of God grows, and it is not by force or coercion that positive change will be realised. We cannot challenge the authoritarian tendencies in ideologies we deplore by ourselves employing heavy-handed top-down measures which belittle, deplatform, or intimidate. Patience is required for the necessary work of shaping the hearts and minds of future ministers by the process of theological education. Patience is needed for the nurturing of generous, open-hearted young people who are secure in their own faith and warm towards those who do not share it or whose culture is different from their own. The week-by-week formation of the character of God's people through the faithful preaching and exposition of God's word is a slow, patient business too. By patience and through small things, we believe that this is how the kingdom goes and this is how the kingdom grows. And we have confidence that God, by his Spirit, continues to breathe his life into the church, which he is still calling to be a prophetic presence in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen and Maria, and well done. Attendees won't know that I emailed Helen and Maria about an hour or so ago saying, I've read through your script and I've looked through your slides. You're not going to get through all this in 20 minutes. And they have, and clearly, and without it being rushed at all. So well done to both of you, and thank you very much. Thank you also for the questions that are coming in. A lot of them are really short and succinct. That's wonderful. I just want to answer one of them now. A question from Leica. Is there a link to the recording of the event just mentioned? I think the event that you're referring to there was the event that Helen and Maria were talking about that resulted in the book. And I think I'm right in saying that the book is basically the record of that event. So just wanted to get that across. We've got some minutes for me to ask you questions now. So let me start with this really vexed issue of terminology. You mentioned extreme right, radical right, far right. I don't know if you use the word hard right, but that is also a term that's gained currency. These are slippery terms, as you say, and there's a real danger that the meaning lies in the eye of the beholder. And basically, if I don't like your politics, I'm going to have a bit of kind of terminological inflation going on there and not just call you right wing, because that would signal that you had a legitimate role, a legitimate voice within debate, but I'm going to call you hard right or far right or extreme right. What can we do to counter that terminological inflation?
It's a real problem, not least partly because of exactly what you described, and partly because different specialists use the terms differently anyway. So whenever you're reading anybody who's writing on this, the first thing you've got to do is work out how they're defining the terms. That's why we've moved, since we published the book, actually, we've moved to the language of extremism, because we feel that anybody who has an issue with us addressing extremism is kind of outing themselves as extremist, I guess. And I've tried to articulate the sense that what is being held in extreme positions and promoting violence is in continuity with at least in some points, with perspectives which seem entirely reasonable. What I want to do, and if I haven't already, I'll out myself as a left-leaning Christian, not wildly leftward, but left-leaning. I really want to sit in this middle ground with right-leaning Christians and say, we're not going to succumb to this polarization. We're going to be willing to sit in dialogue, in tolerance, in generous conversation, and let's together deplore the worst excesses of both ends of the political spectrum. Maria, I'm sure, will have some helpful things to say as well.
Helen's just said about dialogue. What I would say is that we need to, the other thing I would add is that we need to think in terms of reconciliation. And it's that precise kind of dialogue that we need to start that process.
Thank you. Let me ask a question about political issues themselves. This is kind of linked to what we've just been talking about with regards to terminology, but it's more issue focused. I guess my question is, how do you stop guilt by association? By which I mean, you use the phrase Christian adjacent theology, you use the phrase direct continuity there. There are many, many people who have real concerns and very legitimate concerns about, for example, the status of the family or gender critical ideologies or immigration, I guess, is the most obvious one. And they will want to voice those commitments in public ways. But in a sense, you can't stop people sitting next to you, by which I mean you can't stop people who have a seriously antipathetic, sometimes even violent, certainly exclusive agenda, talking about wanting to reduce immigration. And there's a danger of guilt by association then, that, well, I then can't talk about wanting to reduce immigration because people are going to see me as adjacent to the people, even though I despise them. How can you legitimize certain areas of discourse and prevent them from being hijacked by groups that may want to use them for nefarious purposes?
Shall I start, Helen? So I would say by owning it, and I would say by acknowledging that guilt by association. So I'll give you a kind of an example that comes out of my own church. So Helen probably doesn't know this, but I'm quite ardently pro-life. And it's not something that many people actually know about me. They just make assumptions. But I am constantly mortified whenever I walk around central London and I see people praying the rosary or protesting in front of abortion clinics or clinics offering women advice, because to me that is a violent form of behaviour. But if I don't stand up to those people, and if I don't go and dialogue with them and try to explain to them that what they're doing is a form of violence, and that the Catholic Church, or all churches, teach that non-violent action is the best way forward, and this is what non-violent action is, then I'm just as guilty. So,
but let me just push back on that gently. I mean, surely it's stretching the definition of violence somewhat to claim that praying the rosary is a violent action. Presumably those people would say, no, this is a non-violent protest. This is precisely a non-violent protest.
But it's not, because the intention behind it is to upset or to harm.
Do you know that? I mean,
yes, I do, from talking to these people. They want to upset the women going in. They want to upset and challenge the people going into working in these organisations. And praying the rosary is probably one of the mildest things they do. And these protests can often turn quite violent. So it's very easy to tip over unless they have that idea of non-violence in their mind, which they don't, because you can understand that by having conversations with them. And we've seen that it's tipped over in the States into bombings and things like that. So, no, I would argue probably all my female ancestors are turning in their graves now, but that is not a non-violent. Praying the rosary in front of an abortion clinic is not a non-violent action.
Thank you, Helen.
Sorry.
Oh, so did you want to continue, Maria?
No, that's all I wanted to say is we need to own it.
Thank you, Helen.
Yeah, and thank you. And I was going to probably go in a slightly different direction, but start exactly where you started, Maria, which is I think articulating it in the way you just did, Nick, is the beginning of addressing it. And I suppose I just keep coming back to holding the centre ground, which right now feels like a really brave thing to do. It's very easy. And so you mentioned that I direct this organisation called the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence. So we think about this particular issue. We think about a lot of other issues where you've got intersection of scripture and violence. And I am continually being tugged in one direction or the other of both the theological spectrum and the political spectrum. And people continually want to co-opt what we do to their particular end of that spectrum. And it's really uncomfortable. It would be very, very easy just to allow us to become co-opted in one direction or another. It would, quite frankly, make my life a lot easier. And it's sitting in that middle ground, just without wanting to say for me, because I'm not wanting to say that, but it is difficult and it's courageous these days. And so I think we need to be prepared to speak boldly and ironically and not allow those agendas to be only spoken about by those who are not ironic.
Thank you. I'm going to get one more question in before we go to our respondents. I wrote a book about 15 years ago in 2011 on the influence of the Bible on British political life. And I made the point in the book that the Bible is probably the single most influential text in our political history. And I think you can make a very good case for that. But thinking about that in the context of so much of the discourse that you've talked about defending Christian civilization, defending our Christian nation, kind of makes me a bit anxious, really. Is it always wrong to want to defend Christian heritage or the influence, in this particular case, the Bible has had on our political life. Is that always going to be a problematic approach, public religion?
No, I don't think it's always wrong, but I think it's how we do it and with what humility we do it and with what nuance we do it. So I'm a Baptist, and that means that there'll be many people on the call who won't know what that means. Most people think it just means boring in the middle of the road. What it means is that the Baptists in the 17th century refused to be co-opted to state religion and said we will sit on the edge rather than push for power. And for me, that's a really important thing to hold on to. But what I need to also learn from is from the established church, which, although I actually don't agree with established church, I do want to say that they teach me a lot about the ways that the Christian church through history has had a positive influence on national life. Now, I don't want to overstate that. There are obviously, and this is what I study. We look at the ways that the Bible got drawn into the colonial projects and to slavery and so on. There's a lot of harm in the past as well, but there's also a lot of good in our past. And I want us to be able to acknowledge that and to be honest about that and about the negatives, and move forward from a position of truthfulness and nuance rather than absolute denial or absolute endorsement.
Maria, did you want to add to that?
No, Helen's kind of summed up what I was going to say, so...
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think when you have history doing your kind of PR for you in a way that's uncomplicated, you're not doing justice to history. Let me introduce our three respondents. Robert Beckford is an academic and a broadcaster. He's the author of numerous books and documentaries, both for TV and radio, including The Battle for Christianity. Anna Richards is the Church of England's National Public Policy Advisor with responsibility for popular culture, modern society, contemporary spirituality and apologetics. And Nick Lowells is the founder and CEO of Hope Not Hate, having before that worked for the anti-fascist magazine Searchlight. Thank you all very much indeed for agreeing to respond to Helen and Maria. I'm going to ask Robert first, then Anne, and then Nick to share our thoughts before we go to questions from the audience. Robert, over to you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Helen and Maria, for that wonderful presentation and for the book. I was able to read parts of the book, so my presentation isn't made just solely in response to this presentation, but also deals with the broader issue of the book itself. So I'll just read what I've written. It should only take me 5 or 6 minutes, so I wasn't sure how long I had. I'm Pentecostal, so we work with a different kind of cosmology. So I've written it down to stick with the in the time frame. The publication of The Churches and the Far Right is both timely and necessary. In an era where political extremism is being mainstreamed across Europe and the United States, the role of Christian institutions in either resisting or enabling far-right ideologies must be critically examined. The book offers a seminal contribution to this discussion by addressing how churches have responded to, or in some cases, accommodated far-right movements. It situates these issues within the broader historical and political landscape, arguing that Christian communities must take a more active role in resisting racism, nationalism, and xenophobia. However, while the book's aims are laudable, its approach overlooks a critical dimension of the subject: the history, traditions, and theologies of Black British Christian resistance to far-right violence and racist ideologies. The threat posed by the far right is not a new phenomenon for Black Christian communities in Britain, particularly those of Caribbean heritage. Since we arrived in large numbers during the so-called Windrush era, Black Caribbean people have been targets of racist violence, police brutality, and systemic discrimination. The murder of the Black Christian brother, Kelso Cochran, in 1959 was a defining moment in this history. Yet, far-right violence against Black Britons predates even this tragedy. Colonial theorists Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire locate the roots of European fascism in the colonization of Africa, and therefore, rather than an aberration in European polity, fascism and far-right activism is a continuity of a long-standing authoritarian anti-Blackness. The book's failure to sufficiently engage with this history results in a partial and ultimately distorted account of the church's engagement with the far right. There is much to be learned from examining Black religious traditions in Britain. Black-led churches did not emerge in a political vacuum. They were founded as a direct response to diverse forms of racialized oppression within white majority Christian institutions. Importantly, for many Black Christians, the right has always had proclivities inside mainstream Christian churches. And there is a long history of Black Christians challenging racist ideologies within the very structures of British Christianity. Equally, since the 1970s, Rastafarian activists have marched, produced music, and organized against far-right insurgency in the inner cities. For example, and I'm showing my age here, the Rastafarian reggae band Steel Pulse not only toured with Red Wedge and other anti-racist music tours of Britain, but also wrote the anti-fascist song Ku Klux Klan in the 1980s. The failure to consider these traditions is significant. There is a risk of perpetuating a false narrative in which white Christian traditions are the primary or only actors in this struggle. Beyond the institutional neglect, the churches on the far right also fails to engage with Black theological perspectives on racism, fascism, and Christian complicity with white supremacy. Black theology, particularly in its British incarnation, has been a crucial intellectual and spiritual resource in resisting racial injustice, including confronting far-right activism in Britain. For example, 2 decades ago, I made a documentary film for Channel 4 where I, as a working-class African-Caribbean man, engaged in a critical dialogue with white working-class supporters of the British National Party in Dagenham. The cumulative effect of these omissions is a troubling erasure of Blackness from a discussion that should, by definition, center those most affected by far-right violence, both physical and epistemic. For instance, there is no recognition of the seduction of West African Christians by far-right groups in the UK and America. Remember, a West African diaspora choir, Spirit Embassy London from Tottenham, gave a very poor rendition of Land of Hope and Glory at the Tommy Robinson rally in London last summer. I'm a gospel connoisseur, so you know it was a very poor rendition, I can tell you. And the only African invited to President Trump's inauguration, there were no political leaders, was a Nigerian mega-church pastor. Even Donald Trump understood this new connection that's developing between the right in America and the right in parts of the Black Christian community. These omissions are not merely an academic oversight, it's a deletion that replicates the dynamics of exclusion and marginalization that the book purports to challenge. Moreover, this erasure has real-world consequences. It renders Black British Christian voices, it renders Black British Christians voiceless in a discussion about their history and struggles, reinforcing the idea that those racialized as white are the primary agents of anti-racist activism. In doing so, it perpetuates a narrative in which Black Christians are seen as passive recipients of white Christian advocacy rather than active agents of resistance in their own right. While I welcome this book in conclusion as a timely intervention, if the goal is to offer a comprehensive or even honest account of how Christian institutions engage with the far right, future work must center the histories, traditions, and theologies of those affected by racist violence. Anything less risks reproducing the very injustice that the book seeks to challenge. Thank you.
Robert, Anne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for inviting me today. And thanks especially to Helen and Maria for the presentation that we've had today. And thank you, Robert, for what you have just added to our understanding of this very rich discourse, this rich discussion. But I would also say that it's especially timely. I can't tell you in my role at the Church of England yesterday how many calls I had about what is the Christian response to the President of the United States, arguably the most powerful person in the world, posting an AI-generated video of a promised land full of white people, in which not manna but money rains from the skies, and which has been turned into this sort of utopia of skyscrapers, of business enterprise, and in which the people who occupy that land, whose land it is, who's lived there, whose homes have been ruined and whose families have been destroyed, are completely not present. So with a huge gold statue of Donald Trump in the middle of it, what are we to make of these religious tropes that are being offered through that kind of video, in the suggestion that this is how the world is supposed to be through the exercise of power? So I start with this timeliness of talking about these kinds of issues. But the other thing I want to do in response to what we've heard already is to try and just humanize it a bit. We talk about the far right, the extreme right, the hard right, whatever. But who are these people? It is my job to monitor the accounts and the groups and organisations of these people who have these ideas, have these thoughts, and enter into this kind of discourse. But I am fascinated to know who these people are. Where are they coming from? Where do they get these ideas? And what are their issues? What are they going on about? I should also just very quickly say that, well, although we're talking about this in relation to Christianity, I also monitor white supremacist groups, which come, for example, from pagan traditions, and who look back to their pagan understanding of what it is to be a human being and to occupy land, and have white supremacist views based on that. So it's not just a Christian issue, if you like, because other pagans are very concerned about the rise of extremist views, particularly white supremacist views, in relation to their own religion as well. So that's another thing just to say. But first of all, a while ago, after the Brexit vote, I live in Thurrock in southwest Essex, which had a very high Brexit vote for Brexit, and also has had a lot of representation from UKIP, but also now has a very high reform vote. So this is the demographic that we're talking about. Did some research at the time of Brexit, and I asked people who were Christians who regularly went to church if they voted for Brexit, and if so, why that was. What was it that was actually driving that vote at the ballot box? One of the saddest things I heard from a person was that he said to me, "Look, I do not love my neighbour. I know I should, but I don't. I don't love my neighbour, and I want to see my neighbour gone." And he said, one of the things about being a member of a church is that you can't say that. You can't express what's behind that in the church. So this was all boiling away in his mind. You're supposed to be nice, kind, friendly to everyone, welcoming to everyone. You're trying to live a Christian life. You're trying to live humbly. You're trying to live as a disciple of Christ. But in the end, I don't love my neighbour, and I have nobody to talk to about that. Nobody to pray with me about that. So I went to the ballot box and I voted to leave the European Union. So one of the questions is, is the church safe enough to express unpopular, difficult, damaging views? Can it be a safe space where people can say, I have these worries, I have these anxieties, and I have these concerns? Because one of the things I notice in talking to people from these kinds of persuasions is that at the back of it all are often very, very mundane, stupid things that they are really, really worried about, and which generate fear, anxiety, shame, and a sense of threat. So then, having discovered a sense of threat, where's this threat coming from? It's from the people least like myself. And no, the church isn't helping people to deal with these fears and anxieties and shames at root level. So it can be something as simple as, I'm worried that if my mum gets sick, she won't get a GP appointment because all these other people are taking up the appointments. It can be, I'm worried that my son won't inherit my business, my plumbing business or whatever, because all these people are taking the jobs. It can be, I'm just thinking about somebody I was speaking to with these kinds of views just last week, and it was about cars. It's about, he'd got all sorts of strange ideas about Sadiq Khan is anti-car, is making it impossible for me to drive my car. It's impacting my life, my business, my family. And I believe that Sadiq Khan is controlled by Bill Gates. So one of the things that came up in the slides was conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theory and these kinds of exceptional extreme views often go together, I think. And we need to understand what drives conspiracy theory, and this idea that some shadowy power is actually making these things happen which impact my life. So the sense of disempowerment is often a very powerful driver for articulating these views. Who is taking my power away, and who is actually enabling that? And one of the things that hasn't come up so far is the argument from those on the far right, extreme right, whatever you want to call it. I don't like those labels personally, is that there are weak leaders, including, for example, Keir Starmer, but also including the Archbishop of Canterbury. And church leaders. They're weak. They're just not going to protect us and our interests. And so we have to be strong instead. And if there's nobody to speak for, as it were, muscular Christianity, then we will be those people, and we will interpret what it means to have a Christian heritage, to be a cultural Christian, if you want to put it like that. The things that my family lived and died upon, those things have got to be articulated from a position of strength. The church is all about being weak, so we can't put any sort of faith in the church. So that's the second thing about disempowerment and weak leaders. The third thing, which is something I'm working on at the moment, is the rise of toxic masculinities and misogyny. Huge amounts of misogynistic discourse associated with far-right discourse as well, under the guise of we must protect weak women and children, but women and children have no agency. And they are being taken away, they are being groomed, they are being raped, they are being damaged in various ways. But equally, we do not give women any agency. They are simply ours, and we treat them as we will. And that is also part of the Christian heritage. So in the US, there's a huge sort of range about people saying, well, trad wife is the way to go from the Christian point of view. So that is a complication. And finally, I would just say something about the issue of labelling. When we talk about these things, even as we've talked about them today, when we label people, we already put them in boxes, which then they say, well, if you're going to call us that, that's what we are. So on social media, you've got a phenomenon called FAFO, fuck around and find out. It's an incitement to violence. But basically, it's also a response to being called idiots, being called thugs or morons, or those sorts of extreme labels that some of these people are taking to themselves and want to express in the public sphere, or even on the ground in the form of violence. So those are sort of some things about actually trying to see the people who espouse these views and where they're coming from, just for us to talk about. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you very much indeed. And Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I feel slightly intimidated here, in the sense of I come from a anti-racist, anti-fascist tradition, but I'm really pleased to be here. I was really fascinated with both the talk and the book, and really want to engage going forward. A few key points, very short points. I think that if we look at what is happening now, we certainly do have the rise of Christian symbolism, language, etc. on the far right, and that's partly coming from individuals, Calvin Robinson, Jim Dawson in Belfast, but also we are seeing more and more money coming over from the US, and that's funding movements both on the street, but also in terms of ideas, and obviously I think with the rise of President Trump and some of the people around him, we're going to increasingly see that on a political level. But what I think we're seeing primarily is what I would call the rise of cultural Christianity. So these are really people who adopt a language without really being Christian in any sense of how they live their lives. But I think, and part of that is being against something, and particularly about Islam, and defending our system. But I also think it's a consequence, and this is what we're increasingly looking at in terms of the driver for the rise of the far right. And I'll get into labelling in a minute, but is the sense of the politics of declinism and the pessimism. There is a an absolute correlation with people who think their lives are getting worse, their country is going in decline, their kids' lives are going to be worse than theirs, and support for extreme parties, far-right ideas, whatever. And I think that for some of these people, the response to declinism in their own personal lives and the society they see around them is to try to latch onto some golden age or some ideology or idea that they want to kind of cling on to. And so I think that there's this kind of cultural Christianity which plays a key role. I was fascinated, Anne, I think it was you who kind of talked about, well, it's a central piece in the book as well, about the role of the church and the need to combat it. And I think, that's obviously really important. And I think that you also mentioned that about defending the centre ground, and actually that's increasingly difficult because the rhetoric is aggressive, the rhetoric is quite violent, and you can kind of feel, and I know from my own experience, you can feel quite isolated in that space. So I think we have to take on these ideas. I think the question is how we do it as well, how we speak to people, and how we speak to people from where they are and not where we are or where we would like them to be. And I think that, that's not only kind of an issue for Christian faith, but it's a big issue for us all in that kind of progressive space. How do we engage with people who are not in the same place as ours without lecturing them, demonizing them, and taking them on a journey? And I think there's a real need for training, support, and how we empathize with people and how we listen to people as well. And as I say, that's an issue for beyond the church, but I think in this context. The other thing I'd say, just very quickly, I know I don't have a lot of time, but couple of other things I'd say is that I think that we need to look at this in the wider context. I think that what we're now seeing in the UK and probably internationally, but certainly in the UK, is the rise of religious identity across all faiths. And within that there is the be it the adopting or the manipulation, whatever, on kind of more hardline or more conservative ideas. And I think that there is a kind of fracturing at a community level. And I think this is going to grow, and this is going to be a major issue for us all over the next few years, and how we navigate that and how we deal with that. And that's going to increasingly come into the political context as well. So I think there's some real, if we're feeling their challenges now, I think the challenges are going to grow over the next few years. And the final point, and this is more self-reflective in terms of myself and Hope Not Hate and that wider progressive world, just as I think that we're looking at the issue about Christianity and the far right in that kind of cultural sphere, and what drives it's often from outside that Christian space, and it's about people's experiences and struggles and pressures on their lives. So the answer has to be broader than just the kind of, from inside the Christian communities as well. And I think that there is a real role to play in terms of the progressive movement and the secular movement, which actually has either at best been agnostic towards people of faith, at worst it's been quite hostile. And actually there is a real sense of self-reflection that we need to do, not only in terms of how do we deal with faith and faith organisations, but how do we become allies and partners in this? Because, as I say, what's driving this is often issues from outside of faith that are finding a kind of articulation and an identity in faith, and in this case Christianity. So that's something that I personally really interested in, and I'm really keen to talk to people about going forward as well.
Very much indeed. It will not have escaped people's notice. It's 1:30. We are going to continue. Obviously, leave if this is your lunch hour or whatever. But I think we've got we've got a lot of material here. But I'm going to go on to at least kind of 1:45, assuming that our panelists and respondents are able to stay that long. Helen, Maria, I know you will be itching to respond to the comments that the respondents have made, and what I'm going to do, though, is whilst people have been talking, I've been trying to collate some of the many questions and comments we've been getting in. So by all means, do respond to the respondents. But I'm going to put to you some of the questions that we've heard from the attendees, because I want them to be brought in as well. And as I said, I've been trying to loosely group them. There's a kind of a group of questions, and this actually picks up on what Nick was talking about then, about what you might call cultural Christianity and the need for there actually to be some cogent biblical or theological response to this. So is theological life learning not lifelong? Should it not be for priests and vicars rather than people who are training to be them? How do you interpret the scripture that the kingdom of God suffers violence and the violent take it by force? That's, I guess, a question for which you'll be very familiar, Helen. Somebody said increasing numbers of Christians don't go to church, but follow online groups. Any thoughts on how can we continue to reach them? So I guess that this is the first group of questions around what practical difference can theological or biblical teaching make in this case, in this situation?
Do you want to go first, Maria, or shall I? Okay. It's a huge question, though, isn't it? A huge set of questions. I should have actually jotted them down as you were speaking. So is theological education lifelong? Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm passionate about that. But I don't want to release people to the churches until they've got a grounding in this. So that's something I would say there. But I want us to continue to have these sorts of dialogues all the time. The sort of question around the kingdom of God, the violent take the kingdom of God by force, it's a tricky text. I guess I've written a book on this question, and I'm not sure I'm going to try and cash it out into a sentence. And the book is called Blessed are the Peacemakers, A Biblical Theology of Human Violence, where I try to tease out that question, broadly speaking, and respond to it, I hope, with nuance. Ultimately, so sorry to plug something else, but I think that question deserves a bigger answer than I can give to it. The question about how our theological positions can play into this conversation, can join this conversation. It's tricky, this is. So what provoked, I kind of left this out of the presentation because we only had 20 minutes, but what provoked me to put in the application for the BA grant and run that colloquium was Strobel and Schmeidel's plea that Christians stop saying, oh, but that's only nominal Christians, that's nothing to do with us, and kind of draw this deep ditch between the true church and the kind of the apostate church that is doing all this stuff, and acknowledge that this is a problem that the church has a responsibility towards. And I wanted us to discuss that in the symposium, as indeed we did, or colloquium rather. So I think yes and no to that. I do think that there is really important that we have robust theological discussions around this, and that we offer theological responses to some of the theological claims that are made. I also want to acknowledge that actually many people putting out these theological claims aren't interested or aren't able to access or aren't really wanting to engage with a nuanced theological position because they are what Nick just described as cultural Christians. So yes, I think it's really important that we do good theology, that we do good theology in our colleges and our churches, so that church attending Christians are more resistant to these appeals. But I also want to acknowledge the limitation of how far we can reach in that way.
Thank you. Maria, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree that like ministry is lifelong learning, but some churches don't offer that. But the other thing I'll say is, in some seminaries, and I teach in a seminary, these kind of issues aren't even being raised. And I noticed one of the attendees has got a bespoke program on this, and that's music to my ears. So I think we have to start somewhere, and I think we're starting from a very low floor at the moment. So it needs to be built up.
Thank you very much. We've had a number of questions about immigration. I think they are worth clustering together because this is clearly a very, very important issue. One person said, do any of the speakers feel that calls for major immigration restrictions or mass deportations in the UK are necessarily far right? Somebody else said, many on the right have concerns for the vulnerable among native Britons, the poor, women, children. They want to be good Samaritans towards them. Immigrants then seem like neighbours forced on them by the state, who have imported them in pursuit of cheap labour and higher GDP, making it harder to love the neighbours who are already here. Is this rationale for opposing immigration valid? do either you want to take either of those specific questions or the wider question of immigration here?
I'll have a shot at it. And again, I sorry to keep saying the same thing in different ways, but I just want us to have nuance and in these conversations. So I want to be able to say, whatever my personal opinion on immigration is, I don't think that should be should become the language of racism. And I would say, so we need to be able to have a variety of stances towards that question. Without tarring one another as being far right. So I tried to jot down exactly how the questions were phrased. The language of immigration restriction being inherently far right, and I would say no. The language of mass deportation being inherently far right, well, that I find concerning. So that's kind of how I would initially respond to that. But I'd want to know what people are saying by these things. And the language of the second question about neighbours being forced on us by the state is really interesting. And I think there's validity to these perspectives. I suppose I would also want to introduce into that conversation the idea that who is my neighbour, which Jesus explores in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's really complex, and it's especially complex these days when my neighbour I can see my neighbour dying on the television screen in front of me in a way that I couldn't have done 100 years ago. So these are complex things. I suppose that little thing which was slipped in towards the end about the things that the church is doing, both either for asylum seekers and so on, and for kind of poor white communities, not becoming pitted in opposition to one another, I think is part of this conversation, that we need to learn to minister to hardship more generally, without putting these things into silos. I realise that I'm not answering any of these questions adequately. I'm just trying to gesture at a few things.
We're giving you 90 seconds to do so, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. Maria, did you have something to pitch in, or can I go to the next question?
Go to the next question. We're short on time.
Okay, so I've had a couple of people say, can we hear your response? I think both of your response to Robert Beckford's critique that they haven't looked at the experience of the Black British Church with the far right. Could you respond to that one?
Yeah, do you want me to take that, Maria?
I'll kind of...
Yeah, it's a mea culpa. We acknowledge this. We acknowledge it in the book as well. We tried really hard, and I know that this has not satisfied people. I'm not just speaking about Robert, I'm speaking at other conversations I've had. We tried really hard. We invited, I think it's 5 or 6 different Black contributors, and we were just turned down again and again and again. We did eventually secure somebody, and then they were unable to attend. And so we debated with, whether we should invite somebody later to contribute to the book, but the book was trying to replicate the dialogue we'd had in the room. So it is inadequate. I acknowledge that, and I really grieve it. And I'm really sorry, really, really sorry that it has upset some of our Black brothers and sisters. It was never our intention. So we acknowledge that deficiency, but we did try.
Thank you, Helen. Maria?
I would just like to add my mea culpa as well. Helen, it was actually 8 people we tried.
Was it 8?
Yeah, and we did have a Black British contributor who pulled out at the very last minute. We don't know why. But it actually, I grew up in Tottenham, so I grew up kind of cheek by jowl with the African Caribbean community, and witnessed firsthand the level of racism that was just directed at them. So it actually causes me pain to realise that I've done something hurtful. And if I could go back and change it, I would, if I could find someone to contribute to the book.
Thank you both very much. Somebody mentioned in the responses religious tropes, and I want to pick up a question asked by David here, because there's a danger, I guess, that this whole conversation takes place at quite a kind of cerebral or policy level. David's question was, the emphasis on teaching scripture faithfully is valid. However, experience shows that many who respond positively to extreme ideology, left or right, do so on the basis of symbols and symbolic actions. What symbols can we reclaim, develop or deploy going beyond the rational to appeal to those who are drawn to extreme ideologies?
Good question. I mean, it's an important issue. I'm not sure I've got any good answers though. I mean, the cross is obviously our central symbol, and I don't want. And I'm aware that I spoke about the use of it. Its use by Britain First, which was horrible and aggressive and violent. And of course, that's by no means the first time that the cross has been deployed in such ways. I'm thinking about the ways that I think. I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but I understand that during the Bosnian conflict that certain Serb activists, Serb soldiers, carved crosses into the foreheads of people that they had murdered. So it's hideous. It's abysmal in the most technical sense of that term. It's abysmal, but I'm not willing to surrender that symbol because it is our central symbol. But I don't have a good answer to how we do that and more widely either. And I welcome ideas.
So I would just add in, because at the end of that question it talks about reimagining St. George's Day, is we need to I can't believe I'm saying that, we need to reclaim flags. And we actually, so I have a visceral reaction to a Union flag, just because of like my circumstances growing up. But we need to actually kind of think about what the Cross of St. George means and what it means to like English people, and perhaps have a dialogue around that. That would be kind of one thing I would say because I think there is a crisis of national identity in the UK today that I think we need to start thinking about.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question that's come up, and then I want to very briefly give our respondents an opportunity to say a quick last word if they still here have anything to say. It's a question about young men. I guess this is partly because the Andrew Tate story is in the news this morning, having left Romania, having been in the US, and a number of questions have pointed out the real vulnerability that young men in particular have to being drawn into extremist ideologies. Anything specific that can be done around that?
Maria, I've gone first several times. Do you want to go first on this one?
Actually, I think I hate to point to someone else, but I know Hope Not Hate has done some really good research on this. So
that's a beautiful way of drawing Nick in before he has to go. Nick, do you want to reflect on that?
I mean, I think this is a much bigger issue than just how it impacts in terms of the Catholic Church or whatever. I mean, I think that, and a lot of people are scratching their heads about this. What I would say is that I think we can't legislate against this. We have to, yes, I mean, obviously certain extreme behaviour, whatever, we obviously do. But actually we need, I think, two key things. We need to create a counter culture from amongst their peers, amongst young people themselves. Because to be honest, if you're young and male, and this isn't just a race thing, this is across communities. The far right and some of these narratives are very attractive at the moment, and people want to become part of it. So I think that we need a counterculture. I think there's a wider issue of young men and their status in society and how often they're failing and how often they are kind of I say excluded, but if you look at education, etc., and I think there's some deeper issues here that we need to address. Obviously, there's things like social media as well, but I think that this is a societal problem. And the final thing I'd say very, very quickly, what we are seeing now, and Southport was a good example of this, we're seeing a growing number of young men who are not really attaching themselves to any one particular ideology, and they're taking whatever they want from each, and their common theme is about violence and really extreme violence, and the rise of cults that are drawing in all forms of extremist ideology to justify violence, and these are often teenagers, and this is a really growing problem, and I think it is a major societal issue that we have to address more than just the Christian churches.
That's very helpful, Dick. Thank you very much, Nick. Anne and Robert, do you have any final reflections you wanted to give us?
Could I just respond to the question about tropes and Christian symbolism? Because one of the things I've done with an ecumenical theology group is to produce a series of resources which look at saints and the stories of the saints in relation to things that are going on in the world today. So, for example, we have a whole series of resources on St. Winifred, who was murdered by a jealous suitor, and how those stories actually feed into some of the issues for younger people today, looking at the mission of the saints, but also the miracles and the mystery behind their stories. And those have proved very popular in connecting with churches that are dedicated to such saints, but also finding in those history of Christian thought and understanding something which speaks very powerfully into modern problems of today. So I just wanted to raise that.
That's very nice. And thank you very much. Robert?
Yeah, just two things quickly. Just to say, in response to what Anna said, I've also created some resources around this. I made a 2-hour documentary, it's still online, called The Real Patron Saints, which attempts to rethink the patron saints of the British Isles in light of multicultural inclusion and diversity. So again, that's another 20-year-old resource which attempted to address this issue some time ago. Also, just to say, I think that we need to think about the theological educational starting point as a question of an emergency, especially given the fact that theological education in Britain is limited in terms of its engagement with issues around race, racial justice, racial inclusion, and also I think is on current numbers only has 3 people of minoritized backgrounds teaching in the British university system, which means there's more diversity amongst geographers than theologians at this moment. I've got nothing against geographers, but I'm just using it as a comparison. So I think we need to teach it. We need to look at our theological education as an issue of crisis in regards to this issue. So just those 2 points. Thank you.
Good points. Thank you very much indeed, Robert. Helen, you mentioned me something about pointing towards events in Birmingham. Did you want to say something very quickly about that?
Thank you. Just very quickly, the question about how we can reclaim sort of Englishness, or that this question of national identity, is I hope going to be at the heart of our event that we're running on the 1st of April at Birmingham. So if you Google the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence and Eventbrite, I think you'll find it, and we'll have a good panel of discussion there.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Helen, Robert, and Nick, for your contributions. I'm aware we've packed in an awful lot. Thank you also for questions from the floor. I'm really sorry we didn't get to even probably a quarter of them. There were an awful lot, but I hope we covered some of the ground. This is a sobering conversation. It's an important conversation. It's a conversation that's not going to be going away. It's one of the subjects that we are particularly interested in Theos, because we are very focused on providing, as I said, a cogent, thoughtful, winsome, attractive story about Christianity in public life. So I think this is an issue that we return to. In the meantime, thank you all very much indeed for giving us your time, and I hope you have a very pleasant rest of the day. Cheerio.